name is Pastor Dave Lisner, and I serve here at the Newport Baptist Church, and I wanted to welcome you to our very first online service. As all of you know, our world is in a mess right now. We've been battling this coronavirus for just a couple of weeks, and the anxiety level in our country couldn't be higher. I mean, people are stressed right now. They're stressed about their health. They're stressed about whether or not they're going to get groceries. They're stressed about their retirement accounts. They're stressed about graduations and activities, vacations. Things have just come to a screeching halt. And I wanted to put together a brief message from the heart that just hopefully will give you a little bit of encouragement and some hope during the middle of these very dark times. I also wanted to welcome you to my library. Many of you have never seen my office before, and behind me are some of my tools. I kind of liken this place to a workshop, and I use my books back here to hone and chisel and craft the sermons that I've been putting together for the last 20 years. So I wanted to welcome you to my little sanctum here. But what I wanted to hopefully do is share a few insights from the scriptures to bring a little bit of hope to your soul, to encourage you and hopefully help you get down the road a little bit further during these difficult days. And over the last few weeks, we've been looking at in church the great I am statements. Jesus had made a series of proclamations that are recorded in John's Gospel, which are a reflection back to something that Moses had experienced when he had a theophany with God in the Exodus story at the burning bush. Moses was about to return to the Egyptians, and he was being commanded by God to go and deliver the people of Israel. And he asked this great question. He said, who do I say that you are? And God said, I am who I am. And that was the first time we had what we would call one of those great I am statements in the Bible. And when he made that proclamation, he was saying to Moses that he was the God of eternity, that he was timeless, that he transcended space and time, and that he would be the same yesterday, today, and forever. And what he was doing there with Moses in the burning bush scene was revealing a portion of who he was so that Moses would understand and the people of Israel would understand how they would interact with God. Take that same concept and fast forward it now to Jesus. And he also made a series of I am proclamations to reveal to people a little bit about himself so that we might understand how we could relate to God. This becomes very pertinent during a time of crisis because folk are looking for hope. They're looking for some solace. They're looking to build upon something during these uncertain times. And we now have the theological truths concerning Jesus that help us to create that theological edifice by which we can now build our relationship with him. He tells us initially that he was the bread of life, so that he would sustain us as bread would do and nourish and strengthen the soul. He explains he was light, that he would guide us. He explained in John, the beginning of John chapter 10, that he would be the gate, and as a shepherd he would protect the sheep, that he would be our security. And later on in John's Gospel, right after he explains that he is the gate, he goes on to say that he would be the good shepherd. And that's where we want to build today. I wanted to discuss just briefly a few points from John chapter 10, starting in verse 11, that Jesus proclaimed that he is the good shepherd. And in doing so, I believe that as we unpack this passage, we'll understand a little bit more as to what he was saying and how that relates to us today and how it could create a renewed sense of hope and encouragement in our hearts as we're going through some pretty rough times. So let me read for you the passage here. It's John 10, picking up in verse 11. It says, I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. And he who is a hired hand and not a shepherd, who is not the owner of the sheep, sees the wolf coming and leaves the sheep and flees. The wolf snatches them and scatters them. He flees because he's a hired hand and is not concerned about the sheep. I am the good shepherd, and I know my sheep, and my sheep know me, even as the Father knows me, and I know the Father. I lay down my life for the sheep. I have other sheep which are not of this fold, and I must bring them in also, and they will hear my voice, and they'll become one flock with one shepherd. Goes on to say, for this reason the Father loves me, because I lay down my life, so that I may take it up again. No one has taken it away from me, but I lay it down on my own initiative. I have authority to lay it down, and I have authority to take it up again. This commandment I received from my Father. And what we have here in this passage is really two pieces. We have the explanation as to how Jesus is the Good Shepherd, and then he goes on to say how he has authority as this Good Shepherd. First off, Jesus explained his role as the Good Shepherd. And we got to stop right there because the word for good typically in Greek is agathos, which would mean something that's morally good, faithfully good. But Jesus doesn't use that term. He uses a different term in Greek. It's called kalos. And when he says, I am the Good Shepherd, that idea of being good entails having a sense of magnetism, attraction, something that's lovely. When you go in and you say, oh, that's a good piece of meat in the grocery store. Oh, that's a good flower that I see on the roadside. There's something that's attracting us to it. And that's what Jesus is saying here in the passage. So he starts out with this descriptive word, good, to describe how he is going to serve as a shepherd. Now, many people in that day and age understood what shepherds did. They took care of sheep. They led them, they fed them, they brought them to the watering holes, they protected the sheep. And this is one of the areas that Jesus is going to emphasize, that he is going to defend the sheep. When shepherds were out in the fields, they faced two imminent dangers. The first was wild animals, and there was wolves and there was lions, and they would come and attack the flock. And it was expected of the shepherd to defend the sheep. And we see David even speaks of this. Right before the great story of David and Goliath, he says to Saul, I took down the lion and I slayed the bear, and this Philistine's not going to be any different. So he was accustomed to fighting. And in fact, when shepherds started, typically a young child would be out there working with the sheep. As soon as they could walk and keep up with the rest of the guys, they would wander around and start defending sheep, and that was just part of their role. So they knew that they had to fight. It was expected of them to fight the animals and also to fight off thieves. And that was something also very common, is people would try to steal sheep. Well, the shepherd would have to go and do battle with them as well. And just like today, where we expect a first responder, a firefighter to run into a burning building, or we expect a paramedic to go to an accident, or we expect a police officer to put themselves in the face of danger, back in ancient times, they just expected shepherds to fight the animals and fight the thieves, and to take these risks. And this is what Jesus is saying. He is a good shepherd, and he is willing to lay down his life for sheep. He also goes on to make a contrast here between himself and the hired hand. And he's doing this to punctuate his concern and his compassion for the flock. The hired hand's not going to do anything because he's not in it for the sheep. He doesn't own the sheep. He is simply hired there as a steward to take care of the sheep, and he's basically getting a paycheck and going home at the end of the day. And because he lacks the ownership like the shepherd would have, he is not going to take these risks. He's not going to go and make the sacrifices that the shepherd would. Think about it in this light. When you go out to rent a car, are you going to take care of it as much as you would your own, or your home even? I rented a van not too long ago, and this guy was talking about the van, and we were using it to move some of my son's things. And he said, when people rent these things, they really beat on them. They don't take care of these rental vehicles. Why? Because they're not their own. Same thing holds true here. Jesus is punctuating the fact that he has compassion upon the sheep because they belong to him. And he wants that point to be brought home very strongly. So the first point in the passage, which Jesus is accentuating here to his followers, which would include us, is that he is punctuating his concern for the flock. He is making it very clear, crystal clear, that he loves the flock and that he's willing to defend the flock. Point number one. The second part revolves around his authority. He explains that he has the authority as the Good Shepherd, and he starts out with a parallel, that he has a relationship with the Father, and that it is a relationship based on love. There's intimacy there, that he knows the Father and the Father knows him. And he's making this point because that is going to be the parallel relationship that exists between him and his flock. The key word here is to know. It's gnosko in Greek, and it carries with it the idea of having an intimate relationship. For those of you who don't know me, I'm a fan of history, and I love to read about Abraham Lincoln. He is like one of my heroes. I could tell you all about Lincoln and what he had in his pocket on the night he was assassinated, and where he went to study and things like that. But I never met the guy. I could reiterate facts about Lincoln, but I cannot tell you about some of his personal quirks and idiosyncrasies because I never met the man. I only have head knowledge. I do not have personal knowledge. When Jesus is speaking here in the passage about having to know someone, how he would know the Father and the Father knows him and the flock is going to know him and hear his voice, he is speaking in personal terms because he wants the sheep to have a personal relationship with himself. Point number one. Second, he goes on to say that the flock was not going to be limited to Israel. This is an important piece here. He is explaining something that in fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy that the Gentiles would come into the kingdom, he is now going to bring the flock together, consisting of both Jew and Gentile. That wall of separation would be taken down, and now there's going to be a sense of solidarity. So he builds that into his discourse, and then he goes on to say that love was going to propel the relationship between him and the flock. It's the foundation of the relationship between him and the Father, and he wants that to be made clear that the Father and the Son love one another. They're one. And then he's going to go on to say that that's also going to be how the relationship between him and the flock would be. And this is going to be a contrast. This is something very unique in this day and age, because against the backdrop, the cultural and historical backdrop that Jesus is speaking, he's dealing with people that have been interacting with paganism, the Canaanites. And during that time, they were very familiar with how these folk functioned. And their idea of who God or gods were encompassed a very different type of relationship. It was either based on fear or it was based on a trade-off. And when the audience that was hearing Jesus was connecting the dots here with this notion of a love-based relationship, this was something very radical and different in that pagan era. Namely, people would go to worship because they were afraid that their gods or the god that they were worshiping might crush them like a bug. They were concerned about, losing something if they did not follow through with a series of rituals. That's why it is called a fear-based religion. Or they were trying to appease their rendition of God or gods by making sacrifices so that they can get a blessing or something out of the deal. It was basically a trade-off. I'd go and I'd offer some grain, or I'd offer a bull, or I'd offer maybe even my own kid. And what would happen is that they did so in order to receive something from that deity that they were worshiping. And basically, it was like a bargaining chip. And that's how they saw religion. When Jesus comes on the scene, he introduces something that was very radical in that greater cultural context. He's explaining to them that the foundation of the relationship between himself and them would be love. And that term for love here is agape, an unconditional commitment. It is not merited, it is something we don't deserve, but it is something that God still wants us to enjoy. And it's not contingent upon behavior. And that's something that is very comforting, because it is grace. And he is introducing this concept of grace to his followers, that the relationship would be grounded upon a love-graced footing rather than fear or a trade-off. It's also a contrast to the hired hand who is just thinking about himself. So what Jesus is explaining to us here is that this relationship that he desires for us to have, this gnosko, this ability to know, is going to be founded and grounded upon agape, love, and grace. And because Jesus is God, he has the authority now to allow and enable that relationship to come to fruition. He says he's going to lay down his life. Major theme in the passage. He repeats this like 4 or 5 times. He's going to lay down his life. This is the topic. Because he is the good shepherd, he is going to make the sacrifice of himself so that the flock could live. So this is what we call the substitutionary atonement, where he's going to go to the cross and die on your behalf and on mine so that we could have forgiveness and eternal life. And he is going to take up his life, because he has the authority as God, to prove that his sacrifice was holy, pleasing, and acceptable in the sight of God the Father. And that's why he would go on to say that greater love is no one than this, that he laid down his life for his friends. Let me give you a quick picture of what this looks like. Years ago, back in the late 1800s, there was a train, a passenger train, that was pulling into a station. And nearby that train, there was this deep gorge with a bridge. The bridge was under construction. It had a couple of rails that were missing, and it was about maybe half a mile away from the checkpoint where everyone was going to get off at the station. Well, the train pulls in, and the last car on the train suddenly detaches, And it now begins to roll down this track, down this gentle grade. But the problem is it has no brakes. There's about 40, 50 people on the car, and it is slowly going down the track, and it's going to turn, and it moves in the direction of this bridge over this deep gorge that has a few rails that are missing. Everybody realizes that these people in this final car are going to die. They're going to go over that bridge, hit that trestle, and as soon as the train goes into, rolls over the area where there's no tracks, it is going to derail and it's going to plunge into this gorge a couple hundred feet below. They realize that they're in imminent danger. There's a young man who works on the railroad. He sees what's happening and he understands the disaster that's impending. So he runs like crazy. The train is heading toward the gorge. He is running to try to cut it off. The train is moving slowly down the tracks. It's not going terribly fast. It's just rolling along, but it has no brake system, so it continues to roll, continues to roll. The man is running, and finally he gets to the trestle just a couple of seconds before the train does, and he lays down on the rails as a makeshift rail to hopefully be there in place so that the train doesn't skip the tracks and plunge into the gorge. And sure enough, the train comes down and it rolls over. It sadly kills him, but it stays on its course, and he rescued the 40 or 50 people in there. What did he do? He laid down his life for someone else. That's what Jesus did for you and for me when he went to the cross. And that's why it says in the scriptures that greater love has no man than this, that he laid down his life for his friends. That's a picture of our good shepherd. This is the love relationship that God is seeking to establish with people. And this is the foundation that we build on during tough times, because it brings us right now here to our application. Well, point number 2. Jesus built a relationship with his flock on an agape, a loving sacrifice. So let's move on to our application. A couple things very easily. Be a builder and be a beacon. Be a builder, number 1. What do we do with all this information? We build a relationship with God. It is based on grace. It is based on his mercy. It is based on something that he has given to us freely. And as a result, if we place our faith in his work on the cross, we could have a relationship founded upon Christ. And this is where we begin. During these tough times, we need to lean on something. I mean, the government is doing all that they can. Doctors are doing all that they can. First responders are doing all that they can. We have a lot of people in our community who are rallying to try to help us through. But the ultimate source of our strength, the ultimate source of our forgiveness is found in Christ. And what I want to encourage you to do is build upon the rock, Jesus Christ. He loves you. He died for you. He rose 3 days later because he is God and man in full. And he was capable of offering the perfect sacrifice so that we could have a relationship with the Father. So I want to encourage you first and foremost to place your faith in him and build upon the rock. Number 2, cultivate that relationship with him. Now is a perfect time to do it. You don't have to be sitting around watching Netflix all the time. We have, we're all quarantined, so this would be a perfect opportunity to open up your Bible, watch some good videos, and take some time to pray and begin to cultivate that one-on-one relationship with God. He wants it for you. He desires for us to know him. And this is where we begin to establish a friendship with God so that when the storms come, when the trials are hitting us, when we're worrying about things, it's at that moment we could turn to him and rest in his sovereign grace and love and plan for you and for me. So be a builder, build upon the rock. Number 2, be a beacon. Jesus is light and we could be light as well. We live in a world today that is stressed to the max. And every time you turn around, you hear about another person who is climbing up the walls and having a tough time, and this virus and quarantine has just begun. I can't imagine what things are going to be like in about 3 weeks. But what could we do? We could be a beacon to people. We could help people through this tough time. You could pray for folk. And I want to encourage you, pray. Pray for our president. He needs it. Pray for Congress. They need it. Pray for your neighbors. Pray for those who have lost loved ones. Pray for those who are in the hospital. Pray for the doctors, the nurses, all the first responders that are going to be running around out there. Pray for our community on a whole. Pray for children. They are really filled with anxiety right now. Nobody's ever seen anything like this. I mean, we weren't around for the Spanish flu, and I mean, my kids think I'm really old and like older than dirt, but sorry, I did not see the bubonic plague either. So basically, this is new ground and new territory for all of us. So we need to be praying for one another, and it will bring a sense of solace. Be a beacon. Number two, you can care for other people. Folk are going to feel lonely and isolated during this time. And I want to encourage you to be willing to reach out. A quick phone call, send a text, go on FaceTime, get in touch with somebody, a neighbor, a friend, somebody down the street, especially somebody who may be home alone. This is an excellent time for us to just be able to reach out and just show a little love, some encouragement, some care, some support, to just keep and ask people, how are you doing? What you're going through. Just to touch base and check in with a person every once in a while will help them get through this in a very big way. Many of us are wondering, what's going to come of this whole mess, and where's the good, and is it ever going to end? And I have no answer. I don't have a crystal ball. I can't tell you how this thing is all going to pan out. But I will tell you one thing. Moments like this that are very dark, very difficult, create unique opportunities. And I wanted to share with you a quick story and then wrap things up. Back in 250, the year 250, there was a plague similar to this one, and it had been ravaging through the Roman Empire. It actually took root around 250, and it lasted almost 20 years. Many historians believe it was Ebola, and based on the symptoms that people were describing, I mean, folk were getting, diarrhea, the blindness, they were having paralysis, high fevers, bleeding from the orifices, the whole nine. I mean, it was just horrible, horrible plague, and it was wiping out the Roman Empire. At one point during the height of the plague, back then, approximately 5,000 people were dying a day in the city of Rome. Everyone was quarantining. They were hiding in their homes. If somebody in your very home broke out with some symptoms, a rash, dysentery, whatever the case may be, they were literally kicking them out into the streets. Folk were dying in the streets. They didn't have hospitals back then. I mean, they had doctors, but nobody knew what they were doing. And the army was depleted. The economy tanked. They lost 2 emperors to this thing. And during this horrible period of time that was spanning for a long, long stretch, there was a pastor. He was actually a bishop. His name was Cyprian. And what Cyprian saw here wasn't just a plague, but he saw an opportunity. He rallied his church and eventually most of Christendom to reach out and to help the people that were struggling and suffering. A lot of believers died during this plague. Quite a few contracted the virus and succumbed to it. But they took the time and they had the care and the compassion to minister to those who were sick. They buried the dead. They were able to comfort those who were grieving. And the church mobilized and reached out to those who were struggling. The result of that was that Christianity just exploded. Prior to the plague, things were very lethargic in the church. People weren't going to church. They weren't praying. They weren't reaching out to their neighbors. They weren't sharing the gospel. I mean, they were doing a whole lot of nothing. And after the plague, there were so many believers who began to show care and compassion for the person next door, for the people down the street, for friends and relatives and neighbors and coworkers, that the result of that plague was an enormous revival within Christianity. In fact, they named the plague Cyprian's plague because he was the one that spearheaded the efforts to try to reach out and make a difference in the lives of others. It had that type of an impact. Folks, we can have the same type of impact today. There are folk right now that are really hurting. They are wondering about what's going to happen tomorrow, and nobody knows except God. And we know who holds the future. And because we have a relationship with him that we could build upon that rock and we could share that relationship with others, people could find hope and strength and encouragement and the ability to endure this trial. So I want to exhort you, I want to implore you, I want to pray for you, I want to encourage you to go out there and be salt and light for your neighbors. Be there for them. Show them the love of Christ, and they will be drawn to the love of the Good Shepherd. And hopefully they'll see that he not only cares for their needs now, but he cares for their eternal well-being. And he died so that they could have eternal life. And just be willing to avail yourself, and let's watch how God can use each and every one of us during this very dark and difficult time. Thanks for watching. I hope this thing turned out okay. And I want to put this out to you. If you have any questions or you need a call or you have an issue you'd like to discuss, just contact me through Facebook or send me an email. I'm going to have some information here at the end of this little message that you could tune into. But I appreciate you watching, and I hope you tune in again next week when I put my next sermon together. Thank you very much, and God bless. Good night.